Welcome, everyone, or welcome back to our 2025 Israel Studies Winter webinar series. My name is Amichai Magen, and this webinar series is brought to you by the Israel Program at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law here at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. And this winter, we are exploring some of the main dynamics and debates shaping Israel as a society, economy and polity, and we invite you to join us in a series of conversations about those dynamics and debates with some of Israel's leading experts and analysts. Our webinars are free and open, and you can register for as many of them as you like on our website, cddrl.fsi.stanford.edu/Israel. Each webinar is recorded and made available on CDDRL's YouTube channel after the live event. It takes us a couple of days to set that up, but you can simply search for all of our webinars for this winter, last winter, simply by going to Stanford CDDRL on YouTube, and you'll be able to find everything there. Today, I am deeply honored to welcome Professor Eugene Kandel, the Emil Professor of Economics and Finance at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and co-founder with Ron Tsur of the Israel Strategic Futures Institute, which is defined as an apolitical think tank and partnership space for designing strategic and structural solutions to the existential challenges confronting Israel. Professor Kandel combines academic excellence with exceptional policy experience in economics, in government, in finance, and strategic planning. Between 2009 and 2015, he served as head of Israel's National Economic Council and economic advisor to the Prime Minister. So the 6 years following Netanyahu's return to the prime ministership in May 2009. And in that capacity, he advanced both substantial domestic economic reforms and facilitated major international partnerships with the United States, China, the UAE, Singapore, and Jordan. But it is also clear that during his time in government and after, Professor Kandel became very alarmed by what he saw from within the belly of the beast. And this is so much so that he now believes that Israel's current economic, social, and political trajectory is fundamentally unsustainable for the reasons he will articulate momentarily. To his great credit, however, Professor Kandel is not only sounding the alarm, not only offering a diagnosis, but proposing bold new structural directions for the country. Specifically, the Israel Strategic Futures Institute has launched the Israel at 100 initiative with a detailed, empirically based diagnostic report and a set of policy proposals called the Alumot proposals. Alumot is a very interesting word in Hebrew. If it's Alumot with Aleph, it means rays of light. And if it's Alumot with Ayin, it means wheat bushels or bunches of wheat. So perhaps there's a word play there, which Eugene will share with us. Professor Kandel will present the Israel Strategic Futures Institute's diagnosis and proposed policy prescriptions for about 40 minutes, and then we will open up to Q&A. And I remind you, please, on our platform, use the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. I won't be checking the chat tab because I want to focus on your questions. So please submit your questions through the Q&A tab, which is right next to the green share tab. It's right to the right of that. In any event, Professor Eugene Kandel, welcome to the webinar, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Amichai. It's a pleasure and an honor to be there, to be with you. Why is it not doing anything? Can you see in my presentation?
Yes, we can see your presentation. Yeah.
So I want to start. First of all, the melting pot. I don't know whether to those that don't really know the Israel's history to details. Our first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, announced that Israel will be the melting pot for all Jews coming from all places around the world and creating an Israeli. And so the idea is still strong, especially among older people. And we believe that it's a problem because it sort of doesn't work in our favor anymore. I want to suggest say one thing before I start. Actually, two things. One is I want you to imagine for a few minutes United States of America, where United America, without the word states. Okay, imagine the federal government, the local authorities, like the towns and cities, and nothing in between. Okay, so basically you have a unitary system where everybody votes for the federal government, and that government decides that one set of laws applies to everybody in the country. Imagine what would have happened to United States in this day and age that would under this system. So that's one thing. We will come back to that later on. And the other thing, I want to say a couple of things about the term risk management, because I'm going to use it a lot. So risk is when something may happen, which is not particularly good or bad, to you, to your company, to your country, with some probability. It's not certain. When it's certain, it's no longer a risk, it's a reality. But when it has some probability of happening, it's called usually a risk. And in a variety of applications, what we do, we identify the risks, we try to quantify them, we try to quantify the probability of the risk, and then we try to mitigate and adapt to the risk. Like with the best thing is a climate. Climate risk is, we have mitigation, trying to reduce that risk. We also have adaptation, trying to figure out how to adapt to that. Every financial institution, and not just financial, but mostly financial institutions by law in every country have to have risk management senior officials that report to the CEO and the chairman of the board. I'm the chairman of the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange in my spare time, and the officer that deals with risk reports to the CEO and to myself. It's by law, and that person is supposed to tell the CEO and the board when the actions they're trying to undertake or the steps to promote the business of the company are too risky for them to do. And so that is a tension between the promoting the company, doing business, and not bringing company to ruin. So that's sort of what we would like to talk today. And so what I want to talk about is addressing Israel's internal, the stress in the world is internal existential risks. We're not going to talk about Iran. We're not going to talk about Hezbollah or Hamas or any or Houthis for that matter. We're going to talk about Israel inside. So but before, I want to, Michai told me that, asked me to give a little bit of overview of Israeli economy, which will be very relevant to later. So Israeli economy before 2023, over the last decade, has experienced an incredible growth, and we had very high growth, very low unemployment. We had low debt to GDP ratio, much lower than majority of developed countries, very vibrant tech ecosystem, strong currency, in some sense too strong, well-performing stock market, positive immigration balance, and high foreign investor confidence. So there were some challenges with the economic contribution and employment of the Arab population and Haredi population. Haredi means ultra-Orthodox, that we learned to live with, so, at least so far. In Q1 to Q3 2023, when the new government came in, it sort of created a very large political instability because of this so-called judicial reform. And in addition to appointing a whole bunch of really not competent people to various positions, including ministerial as well as governmental positions. But we still enjoyed relatively strong performance. And then the war hit. In 23, 24, not surprisingly, we faced low growth. At the beginning, in October, November 2023, we saw very high unemployment, but it gradually increased over a few because a lot of people were drafted, a lot of businesses closed, a lot of people were displaced. We did grow the debt to GDP ratio, but it's still much lower than most developed countries. And we started seeing negative immigration balance and reduced foreign investor confidence. Still, the reduced foreign investor confidence was mostly focused on small companies. The direct cost of war was about 150 billion shekels. But, you can divide it by about 3.5 to get dollar amount. So we're talking about maybe $40 billion, and another 120 billion of lost GDP. The initial shock to currency and the stock market lasted for about a couple of months and very quickly recovered. Finally, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange was the best performing stock exchange in 2024. The good news was that in the last 6 months, we saw tremendous reduction in military threats surrounding Israel, especially Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. Some of them it was our doing, some of them somebody else did us a favor, but we saw. So those are very good news going forward, and you saw the stock market, which looks forward, respond. Now 35, we're going to see a sizable increase in permanent defense spending of about 1.5% of GDP. By the way, Israel already spends 5.5% of GDP, so we're talking about 7%, which is almost twice the US level, and about 4 to 3 times the European level. We're probably not going to have a lost decade, what it means, lost decade, is that in 1973, after October Yom Kippur War, the defense spending went to 32% of GDP. You heard me well. 32% of GDP, it's unprecedented. And it stayed there in double digits for almost a decade and a half. And so we basically lost a decade of investments, and it's called a lost decade in Israeli economy. We're not going to have that because we are going still to 7% rather than 32%. The economy is much larger, much more resilient. And the problem is that a small group of people, basically 10% of highest income earners in the Jewish non-Haredi population will bear the main burden of the costs of war, as well as other burdens, as we will show. And the main question is, for how long will they be willing to do that? That is basically the opening to our question. And so now I want to present to you 2 scenarios that I can see. So one scenario is that if we continue business as usual, that scenario is not a sure one. It's a probabilistic one. It's a risk. But this risk is existential, and we call it run on the country. And the run on the country is similar to a run on the bank. A run on the bank is, you guys probably very much aware of 2 years ago, there was a run on the Silicon Valley Bank. And within about a week, the banks basically stopped being a bank. If the federal government did not bail it out, it would have collapsed and buried a lot of depositors with it. How did it happen? Well, the bank was the same the day before or a week before. But the week before, a whole bunch of people and companies said to themselves, you know what? I looked at this bank, the balance sheet, etc. Maybe it's not as safe as I thought it was. Maybe there's a small probability that this bank may not return my money. maybe even 0.5% probability, 0.25% probability. It doesn't matter. The minute that you got this thought, what you want to do is tomorrow morning when the bank opens to transfer all the money from that bank. In fact, you can transfer all the money even when the bank is closed because you can do it online. So if that thought occurs to one person or one company, nothing happens to the bank. If that thought occurs to a bunch of companies and individuals, the bank collapses because the bank no longer has enough reserves to allow for these withdrawals. Similarly, we can experience a run on the country where a group of people decides that the future of their children in the country is not great or is not really sustainable. And so then what they do is they say, okay, now I'm going to sell my house, take all my money, transfer it to some other place, find a job, and move together with my family. If 1, 2, 50, several thousand, maybe 20, 30,000 people do that, and then some other people come back, nothing happens. It's like with the bank. It's a normal course of business. But if a significant group of people in the most productive sector, in the most productive income, in the highest income bracket, decide to do that, then the country can no longer sustain itself because its tax base shrinks, and then it has to increase taxes on everybody else, reduce services, that drives another bunch of people out of the country, then they have to do it, and then there's a very, very quick spiral. Now, this risk is predictable, okay? The existence of this risk is predictable, but its timing is not, okay? Because its timing is dependent on people, at what happens in people's heads, in a lot of people's heads. It may be correlated, but you would not necessarily know when it's going to happen. And so people that say, well, you know, it didn't happen, so it won't happen. But that's the same thing with the run on the bank. Nobody a week earlier or 3 weeks earlier could have said that next week Silicon Valley Bank is going to go out of business. You know why we know that? For the very simple reason, because if that was known, it would have happened the minute it was known, okay, or even earlier. So you cannot predict these things. And since they're not predictable, when they happen, they're very fast to spiral, and they cannot, and in many cases, they cannot be stopped. So in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, the federal government bailed it out. But if you have a country, nobody's going to bail the country out. Okay, that's a big problem. And in general, by the way, it happened in quite a few countries. We have our neighbors to the north. Basically, a whole bunch of people left in the 70s, and then in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, and then the country collapsed. Lebanon is a bankrupt country. If you take Venezuela, Venezuela was one of the 10 richest countries in the world in 1980. A few years ago, it didn't have anything to eat. For its people, they were breaking into Colombia and to try to get food. So this is when the elites that support the country's economy leave. And they do it in bulks. Russia, unless it has oil, but if it didn't have oil and gas, it would have collapsed 4 times in the last century. So if this risk exists, it's literally existential risk, because given the threats from outside the country, the same Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Hamas, the Iran, etc., Israel cannot afford to be weak. And so preventing this outcome should be top priority regardless of anybody's political orientation. Anybody who cares about Israel's survival should start worrying about this. But the problem is majority of the population, whether in Israel or outside of Israel, is completely in denial. They're just saying, no, it will be fine. In Israel, there's a saying, it'll be fine. And you continue. So what we propose is that we must move to risk management mode. If you're a bank, you cannot say, well, let's do this and it will be fine. No, there was a risk management officer that identifies the problem and then seeks both mitigation and adaptation. Because otherwise, we might be winning the battles against our enemies, but we may be losing the war. The other scenario is a prosperous, resilient country. And as such, it has to be supported by 4 strong pillars. It's absolute must, especially in Israel. One is a cohesive society, because in light of external threats, you have to be able to mobilize your society in times of need so that everybody feels responsible for all its members. Because otherwise, why would you go and risk your children's lives in the army? And, you know, I did not sleep for 3 years, and then again last year when my son was in the military. And you ask yourself, why do you do that? Well, because you feel that you're responsible for everybody. They're responsible for you and you're responsible for them. Without cohesive society, you cannot sustain the country. Competitive economy, in our case, it not just has to generate sufficient resources for high standard of living as everybody else, but it also has to generate, like we saw, additional 7% for our defense. And it's actually, the numbers are even high if you take into account the reserve duties and other things that are not really priced. We have to have competent government that identifies strategic risks and can execute timely policies. And finally, those 3 allow us for comprehensive security, which is, I'm sorry, something done, which is based on international alliances, but also on all these 3 other pillars. And so what I want to show you is, what do we do with these pillars today under scenario 1 and under scenario 2? So in terms of cohesive society, Israeli population evolved from the melting pot into something completely different. There are 3 populations today in Israel. There is still a majority and 2 minorities, but the minorities are growing faster, and so the majority is shrinking. These are 3 incompatible value systems. And these systems are Jewish democratic vision, where Jewish is broadly defined. So I can choose how to be Jewish or non-Jewish if I want to. And Israel is an integral part of the developed world, and you have a liberal democracy, not the crazy, what is called sometimes liberal democracy, which is craziness, but liberal democracy in a traditional sense, what we knew as a liberal democracy over the last 200 years as it evolved. There is a completely different, no less legitimate, but completely incompatible set of values and visions, is what we call Torah nationalistic vision. That says is basically that there's only one way to be Jewish. The halachically, so the Jewish law determines how you must be Jewish, and the Torah law must dominate any other consideration, including any law or any constitutional provision. It basically says that, yeah, this is a democracy, but whoever wins the elections, you know, can do whatever they want. Well, not whatever they want. They can't kill people, but they basically can change the rules of the game, can take resources to themselves, etc. That group cannot accept Western liberal democracy as a concept, and I can go about it, and it wants to stay relatively separated from the world, at least in terms of culturally. And then there's a third group, no less legitimate, which consists of about half of the Arab population, according to surveys, and some Jews on the really hard secular left. They want a country for all citizens. They don't want Jewish country. So these 3 groups are mutually incompatible, each with each. And in the world where the winner takes all unitary system of government, you necessarily, as a structure, you have a war in defense of everybody's value. It's interesting to see, and surveys show that every large group in Israel feels attacked. It feels that somebody is forcing foreign values on it. Nobody feels that they are forcing anything on anybody else. Okay, so everybody is defending, nobody is attacking. And the question that we ask is, can Israel remain liberal democracy? There's a catch here. Today, the majority, if you ask them and give them a hard choice, they would still choose a liberal democracy. But in 30, 40 years, that is not going to be true anymore. So majority of the population will be more aligned with Torah nationalistic, because that group grows much faster than the majority. And so if a majority doesn't want something, you cannot have it in a democracy. On the other hand, the resilient system in the scenario 2, we can stop this war by protecting all the values. You basically say, live and let live. You don't force your values on me, I don't force values on you. That means that there is a pluralism in laws, because there's no system with unitary system that says, well, we're all going to be living under these set of laws which reflect a certain set of values. So that's already a big change. And that big change goes straight in the face of a melting pot. The second thing, we can cooperate in common goals, and maybe, just maybe, the liberal democracy as one of those values, maybe only for those who really want it. It's hard to swallow for people, but it may not be. The question is, do we lose it for everybody, or do we keep it for those who really want it? The next part is competitive economy. What happens in Israel is we have two populations that are highly subsidized by the third one. So the Arab population and Haredi population today are subsidized at about 55 billion shekels a year. If we bring the composition of the population in 2065 to today, that number would be 125 billion shekels. Now, that I can translate that into two illustrations. One illustration is that subsidy would be higher by 50% than the highest item on Israeli government's budget, 50% higher. So this would be by far the largest item in terms of budget. And two, an average family in the top 10% of income in Jewish non-Haredi population, basically today is subsidizing the Haredi and Arab population at about $40,000 to $50,000 a year. It will grow 4 times. It will be almost $160,000. So apart from what I need to do to pay my share of defense and police and et cetera, and feed my family, I also have to pay $160,000 a year in today's money to sustain another 3 families. Okay, that's clearly that's not possible. And so it will lead, along with the value war, it will lead most productive populations to leave, and we're moving to the doomsday scenario with pretty high probability. The scenario 2, what you have to do is to mandate fiscal responsibility for all groups. So the Haredi group that says, look, in my world, in my set of values, the boys stop learning anything secular at the age of 14, and most of them do not go to work but study Torah. That is not sustainable. And so it basically based, and how do we know that it's not something that religiously demanded? Because we have similar populations elsewhere in the world, and they work and they study and they live similarly ultra-Orthodox lives. In Israel, because of the government for the last 80 years, they're basically a subsidy from everybody else to this population. This population is growing at 4.5% per year, which is one of the highest rates of growth historically. And so that is not sustainable. So we have to stop that. So we have to stop the economic coercion. We have to still subsidize these populations to give them time to adapt, but it has to be a smart subsidy rather than whatever you spend, that will cover. The next one is competent government. I will skip that because Israeli government is structurally incompetent. And I can, if you have questions for that, we have to disconnect.
Eugene, please don't skip that. Go off this quickly because this is really important, and a lot of people are deeply interested in this.
Okay. Please. So I'll say, look, the standard position where you appoint people who have no experience, no expertise, no incentives, and no time to spend on the task, for example, Minister of Transportation or Energy or Finance, and they care about how they're winning the next election, it is very foreign to you because your Secretary of Defense is not trying to win the next elections. He is working for the president. The president may be trying to win the next election, but not his ministers. In Israel, this is the system. And unfortunately, this system, given the war on values, today, it used to be that the ministers, first of all, they were of higher caliber, but even when they were not, they would bring serious civil servants. Today, they no longer bring serious civil servants because they bring civil servants who will help them to get reelected within their party as well as globally. So we're basically completely ruining the government. And it's structurally, the way it's structured, it's not about which party is there. It's structurally incompetent. What we need to do is to create a professional, non-political government, which is accountable to politicians, but you can replace it if it doesn't perform. Okay, basically, if a minister doesn't perform, today you replace him or her. The government falls and the parliament falls, and you have to go to elections. Instead, and that's why they couldn't care less about the performance in there, which is why public mistrust the government 5 minutes after electing. So that's a paradox of Israeli system, and we just can't afford it. And the system stability is another feature, is that in Israeli law, a governance system, there's no since there is no constitution, there's no two-tier parliament system. You basically can have a one-person majority in the parliament, and you can change every basic law. So just to give you an illustration, there are, I believe, 22 amendments to the constitution over the last 200 plus years. In Israel, in one session of parliament, you have more than that amendments of basic laws, which in our case substitute for constitution. So that creates enormous amount of infighting, enormous amount of uncertainty, and all this judicial reform was just an example of that. But it's again structural. We have to bring the system to be stable so that the core system structure can be only changed by a large majority. So that's, again, system instability. So the responses to these to the definitions of threats are either denials on all sides, calls for compromise over values. These values are incompatible, so you can't compromise over it. Fight. A lot of people saying, we will win and we will force our, liberal or our religious views on everybody else. Not going to happen. There are calls for separation into two countries. If you've ever been to Israel, look at the map. We are 22. I just compared us to Greenland. There are 20 plus Israels can be fit in Greenland. Okay, so we are a very small country, and even separating in deciding who's going to belong to whom is sheer impossibility. And then there is a flight. People saying basically, we have no hope, we're gone. What we're offering is let's postpone the flight. Let's stop talking about things that cannot happen, and let's start managing the risk. What is the biggest problem? The biggest problem is that the purists on all sides want all their demands satisfied. And basically they say, we have the high moral ground, therefore the laws have to reflect our values, and all our values must be reflected. The other side says, okay, if you have the right to impose your values on us, we have the right to impose our values on you for the same reason. And so the war never ends. And so what we're saying, look, our goal, regardless of what kind of vision you want, is to prevent scenario one and to accept the reality that we cannot change the people, but we must change the governance system, because it structurally creates a war over values and a war over resources. And we also must be pragmatic and learn from others, because others have been around and shown what can be done pretty well. So there are four principles that we identified and said that any change, any solution has to satisfy these four conditions. One condition is that the only way to prevent value war is to protect everyone's values. If you feel that your values are protected and nobody's threatening them, there's no reason to go to war. You have to introduce fiscal responsibility without immediately collapsing any group. So that has to be part of it. You have to have competent professional government and stability of the governance system. These four features, if even one of them is not satisfied, it leads to the same collapse. But where do we have to start? And this here is Northern Ireland is a good example. You know, Northern Ireland had faced 60 years of bloodshed. People who wanted to stay with the UK, people who wanted to a republic, people who were Catholics, people who were they were all Irish, people who were Protestants. The fighting was really, really bad. Almost 4,000 people lost their lives and tens of thousands were injured. And so when they started, you know, the Americans, George Mitchell, if I remember, came and he established as a prerequisite for starting the discussion is something called parity of esteem principle, which said that everyone's values are equally legitimate as long as their actions don't harm others, and they have equal standing. So there's no somebody has a higher esteem than the other, because the minute you have somebody has the high esteem, they don't want to talk to the others. They want to dictate. It is incredibly difficult to talk to people in Israel in such a charged atmosphere about this principle. They dismiss the legitimacy of the other side. But we have some hope that if it worked after 60 years of bloodshed, maybe it will work in Israel as well. But we definitely have to start there. The Swiss example, and we started when we said, well, how can we satisfy these four conditions? And we went looking for it, and we found some literature from early 20th century. But we basically looked at Switzerland and we realized that they sort of figured it out. Because unlike Israel or any other unitary country, where the power is given from the voters to the top and is delegated down at will, whoever rules delegates as much power as they want down to other levels of government. Now, interesting to mention that Israel is the most centralized country in OECD in terms of how much power goes down. Most of the power stays with the central government. And it's actually even controls the Knesset, the parliament. So there is no difference between the parliament and the government. Whoever controls the parliament controls the government, and vice versa. On the other hand, in Switzerland, they are driven by subsidiarity principle, which says that the power percolates up rather than given up and percolates down. Whatever you can do at the lower level, and it's efficient and effective, you do there. You don't pass the power to do that to anybody above you. So anything that you can do in your town, you do in your town. Then you say, okay, certain things I cannot do in my town, I pass it into cantons in Switzerland. There are 23 cantons, okay, in Switzerland, on the area and the size of the population almost identical to Israel. 23 cantons. Some of them have, 100,000 people. And so then the canton decides what they can do, and then they delegate the power to do certain things to the federal system. So the power is delegated up by the constitution or by confederation laws. It's not really a constitution, it's like a confederation agreement. So that is something that in a divided society, and I must tell you that Swiss are divided by much less divided than Israelis, it works because everybody can choose which canton with which laws and which education systems they want to choose. So we're saying, okay, let's try to modify. It's an example of how we can do that. Let's modify the Swiss model for Israel. So imagine that Israel establishes a purely procedural constitution. Well, the only human rights, imagine that the only human rights you put there is the 10 Commandments. So not all of them either. So this constitution says we establish 3 administrative, non-geographical, value-based units. We call them such unit Alumot. Amichai said it's a ray of light. And each of them has a very different constitution. So Torah nationalistic has one constitution, is basically Torah. The liberal has a different constitution, and the third one has its own little constitution. Every citizen of the country has a passport, Israeli passport, and the ID card of the state. Like in the US of the state, it will have the ID card of the Alumot. What's the difference? They are not ex ante geographically partitioned. They are geographical partitioned, but exposed by choices of people who live in geographies rather than by decree of central government. Now, what do you do within these Alumot? Alumot is the plural in Hebrew for Alumot. So the first thing you do is that all political elections happen within Alumot. That immediately protects everybody's values. So if I chose to be in Alumot with liberal values, nobody else but people who chose to be with liberal values can attack my values. Interesting thing that it also allows you to do is that Knesset, which is Israeli parliament, is no longer elected, but is appointed. And the number of people that each Alumot, and there are only 3 of them, appoints is proportional to the number of people in that Alumot. So you still maintain one person, one vote, but that immediately allows you to appoint a much better people than we get today in our parliament, because you appoint people who have some skills to do something rather than people who can yell. And what's even more important is that since the Knesset is no longer political, the professional federal government is not political either, because it can be replaced at will if it doesn't perform. So the Knesset can come and say, okay, we're going to replace you, or even specific minister, because they don't perform. The third thing that happens within the Alumot is that most taxes are within Alumot, so that allows for fiscal responsibility. The federal budget is financed by Alumot, which agreed to it, but there's mandated fixed subsidy from the richer Alumot to a weaker ones for at least 20 years. But that subsidy is fixed. So all the past subsidy, and it's equal to the subsidy that was given a year before. So you basically say, well, from this year to that year, in the transition, nobody loses anything. But starting from now, all your decisions are your responsibility. And the last thing that ensures stability is that major changes in the constitution must be approved by all Alumot. And so you basically say, look, if we screwed up in the constitution and it's bad for everybody, we'll change it. But if it's an attempt of one or two Alumot to impose something on the third one, they can't do that. Belgium did this in 1970, so it can be done. But they didn't do it well because they had to redo it again and again and again. So so what we learned from Belgium is that such change is possible, and they did it after 140 years of constitutional unitary monarchy. We also know that many democracies are federalist in the different types, and even after the Second World War, Germany, Italy, and Spain were forced to become federalist. But the lesson too is that such a change must be comprehensive, otherwise you continue fighting. There are some implementation challenges that we observe, that we are, people tell us, they say it's a fantasy. Remember, when Theodor Herzl talked about establishing a Jewish state after 2,000 years, that was a fantasy. And we had to get approval from Ottoman Sultan, at that time it was still Sultan. We had to get approval from the British, we had to get approvals from the UN. Today, we don't need anybody's approval. We can change the system at will. So it seems like it's much less of a fantasy. It's not radical. It is, sometimes people say it's radical, but relative to eliminating the existential risk for the country by changing the way you run elections, doesn't seem like radical to me. It is complicated, but there are no simple solutions to really complex problems. So that's, and the feasibility, political feasibility, I've run out of time, but I would argue that it's much more feasible than seemingly simpler solutions, and I can discuss that. And so the last part is that we started this movement to convince Israelis that the threat is real, it's existential, and it may happen within the next 10 to 15 years. We can collapse, decompose or implode as a country. We have to convince the leadership what we want to convince the voters, because the leadership, let's admit it, the leadership in the recent years of Israel remains to be desired, as in many other places in the world. We believe that we can convince large swath of voters to demand from whoever they vote for commitment to a structural change which will solve our inability to live together without being feared and fight with each other. And basically the message is we have time to bring change. We can do it. We don't need anybody's approval, but we have no time to waste on games, basically, or wishful thinking. That's it. That's my thing. Should I stop sharing?
Yes, please, Eugene, so we can turn to a conversation. So thank you very much for this very not only thought-provoking and outside the box presentation, but there's been a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this. You shared with me a detailed report that includes data, public opinion surveys, etc. I don't know whether this is publicly available yet, but it's a very important.
Yeah, you can distribute if people want.
Okay, great. So thank you for that, and we'll create a link to that. in our chapter.
I apologize for
notes.
my English. It's not as polished as I would have wanted.
No, not at all.
Mediocre.
No, not at all. That was very, very lucid. So, Eugene, I mean, there are two main aspects here. One is the diagnosis of the structural, as you call them, internal existential challenges facing Israel, and the other are the policy prescriptions for how we manage that risk. And I'll turn to the question. We currently have about six questions. If people want to pose some additional questions, please do so through the Q&A tab. But let me just play devil's advocate a little bit to push back, just for the sake of us having a good discussion. So a critic would say that the assumption that there are two sort of fundamental assumptions in your diagnosis. One is that demography is destiny, right? That there's a shift in the balance of the nature of the Israeli population away from a more secular, liberal, Western-oriented towards a more religious, nationalist, conservative. That immediately translates into a sort of a values incompatibility, as you say, which is untenable and unsustainable. Related to that, then, is this idea that is built into your proposal, which is that we basically give up on a shared Israeliness, right? The melting pot model, and there are different permutations of this, is based on an idea of a sort of a shared Israeliness that either exists or emerges over time as we share a public space, we share a reality, and there are many who would say that that sort of shared Israeliness, with all its challenges, exists and may exist even more as we invest in creating a shared society. Let me give you an example, and we've seen cases in the past where changes in Israeli policy actually seem to lead to greater integration of the minority groups that you're concerned about: Israeli Arabs, Haredi. We saw in the early 2000s that changes to the welfare system led to an increase, particularly in the labor market participation rate of Haredi women and Arab men in the Israeli population. I was looking a little bit at figures on labor market participation rate of Haredi women. They used to be very, very low, and now Haredi women participate in the Israeli economy at the same level as other Jewish women. There's also some upward social mobility. More Haredi women are getting into accounting and into high tech. So aren't you giving up on sort of a shared Israeliness prematurely? Aren't we able to make less drastic adjustments to the incentive structure in Israel that will create sufficient buy-in of these minority populations that are quickly becoming a much larger share of the population, in order to avoid this very sharp kind of values division? Okay, so that would be one sort of pushback, which would avoid the very difficult political challenges of implementing what you are saying. The other criticism that
Amichai,
yes,
I'm given my age, I can deal with one question.
You want to deal with it, yeah,
especially with such a big question, one question at a
so
time, because I'll just forget it.
Let's begin with that. Okay, so please.
So there are a whole bunch of things here that you said are more wishful thinking than evidence. Some of it, of course, true, and I'm not saying that it's not, but let's first start from shared Israeliness. We do share, at least the Jewish part of the population, that this is the homeland for the Jewish people because we don't have any other. That is common. We share common traditions, holidays, etc., but their interpretation and their observance and their meaning are completely different for different parts of the population. And the last thing is that there seems to be an illusion of shared Israeliness because in Israel today there are three autonomies, which basically when I say autonomy, is that means that a group of the large group within the population either lives by the laws that were adjusted for it, or basically ignores the laws that apply to everybody. And these three groups are the Arab population, because in their case, there's part of it is their doing, but big part of it is that the central government basically ignored them, and so it only started changing in the last decade. But the very high rate of criminal activity within that society, organized crime, et cetera, it's a result of basically neglect. But they live by their own laws in many cases. Most of them do not like that, but that's the case. Haredi society completely lives by its own rules. For example, if you go to Haredi neighborhoods, women sit in the back of the bus, and you cannot do anything with your laws. You would never hear a woman sing, and women in some Haredi neighborhoods cannot walk on one sidewalk. They can only walk on the other sidewalk. This is basically, it's completely illegal to force that, but it's a social norm, and nobody will intervene in that. So there's a whole bunch of other things I can go on and on. And then there's a third society, which is the people who live in Judea and Samaria. Parts of these population basically live by their own laws, given that military law applies there, but even the military law is not observed in many cases. And so you have another autonomy there. And so talking about Israeliness, when there are everybody's supposed to live under the same law, but there are three autonomies, you have very, very little of that. In terms of the risk, whether this risk is smaller, the Haredi woman, and I was very active in that space, moving Haredi women into high tech for about 6 years, and with some pretty good success. It's too little, too late, too slow. What's going to happen to majority of Haredi women that entered the labor force in the last decade? I have one word for you: AI. AI is going to basically decimate that population. Decimate completely, because they have relatively low skills. They are last to come. They do relatively simple routine jobs. And so all of that will be made obsolete by AI very, very quickly. We're talking about 20-30% improvement of productivity already. I mean, we just started. So, but even before that, the average income of a Haredi family, economic income, relative to average income of a non-Haredi Jewish family, has stayed constant over the last 20 years. So all these increases did not change the composition, and it's constant at about 42%. Now, if you take into account that a Haredi family is twice as large, average Haredi family is twice as large as non-Haredi family, basically on a per capita basis, the ratio of economic income is 20%, okay? And now, since this population grows, just the composition effect is driving the GDP growth down. And at some point, it's going to start making it negative, because you're going to, the composition effect will dominate. And the last point is saying, well, we could wait for 10 years and see what happens, but we may not have a country to come back to. And remember that somebody asked a question on the Q&A, is it more likely or less likely than before? First of all, in our opinion, it's much more likely because it's the first time in Israel's history we started seeing political immigration in the last 2 years. And this is we always lost a lot of highly educated people. It was a steady flow. Israel is one of the biggest exporters of the faculty in top universities in the world. But it was always either professional or economic reasons for immigration. We started seeing in the last 2 years, we started seeing political immigration. And the 2024 was the first year with significantly negative. It's not still significant to the extent that we have around in the country, but it is the first time that Israel has a significant net balance of immigration, despite all the anti-Semitism and people coming back, etc. All that true. But people coming back because they see a future in this country. And the minute that Israelis will not see the future, those who came later will not see the future either. So, and the last point is that we're not saying that this is has to happen and will happen with 100% probability. But if we're talking about the combination of never having a country ever again, because we tried this twice and we failed after about 80 years, right about now, and October 7th, because this country will end with October 7, but order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude larger. Okay, because the collapse of this country will not be peaceful. It will not be Czechoslovakia splitting in 2. It will be a collapse either cataclysmic or in one way or the other. So when you think about that level of horror, does it really matter whether the probability of this is 1%, 3%, or 10%? Does it really matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious we want to avoid the cataclysmic, the horrific scenario that you outline. I think that is the given. Then the question becomes sort of how do you do it? And then the question becomes how do you give assurances to the most productive segments of the Israeli population, which, you know, as you correctly say, are getting relatively smaller. How do you provide assurances that there's a future there for their children, their grandchildren, and so on and so forth? I think that is, you know, that's the crux of the issue. Eugene, there's, from just looking at the questions that we have, 2 themes I think sort of come up. One is, isn't this sort of live and let live scenario or solution that you propose actually paradoxically a liberal solution? In other respects, the live and let live, let's just create these separate Alumot, and you respect my values, I respect your values, and we cooperate in some kind of subsidiarity driven federal system. That in itself is a liberal vision. And if we have a deep demographic transition in the direction that you describe, why would a population composed of 40%, 50%, 60%, as you defined it, sort of Torah-based, nationalistic, and not liberal, democratic, cosmopolitan-oriented, why would it accept a sort of a live and let live formula? So I understand that you're trying to sort of lock in a set of values which you see as being procedural and objective, but they're actually liberal and substantive, and therefore, under your own analysis, will not necessarily be accepted by the other Alumot.
That's a very good question. It actually, you can split it into two. Will they accept them today as a way to live together? And will they continue to accept them in the future? Accepting today, certain parts of the population will not accept them. The ones that see the salvation of the people of Israel by God Almighty as the ultimate goal and the necessary condition that they control the entire land of Israel and everybody is religious and observant, their group cannot accept live and let live, because for them, you basically jeopardize the salvation. And so you don't have to even start talking to them because they won't. But that's not the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox want to be left alone. If you ask the ultra-Orthodox what was their experience over the last 80 years, they would tell you that they lived under secular tyranny. Okay, that's their feeling. And so their main goal, as in every other country, is to separate, ring fence their community from everybody else. And let me live within you. I will, part of it, for example, the way they dress is not to get mixed with other populations. It's on purpose. There's no other purpose in this strange, 16th or 17th century garb or 18th century garb. It's only to stay apart. So this system provides them that. Today's system does not. So today you can have a Supreme Court rule that they cannot do things that they feel they must do. Okay? And so they feel attacked. If they move away and they get autonomy that is enshrined in Constitution, that is something of a very, very big value for them. The second thing,
Eugene, will the Haredi or Arab Israeli Alumot go to war to protect the liberal Alumot?
I don't know, but but that is true today as it will be tomorrow. Tomorrow it will be better. And I don't want to go into this issue because it's a very, very complex issue, and I spent 6 years dealing with Haredi draft, etc. It's a big disappointment from the political people who could not bring themselves to solve problems rather than grandstanding. But the point here is that the second point about economic point is that today the fact that Haredi are subsidized are because some of it are because they're poor, but some of it is because in the coalition they basically agree that they will be subsidized more and more in a coalition agreement. It's not in the law. It's in a coalition agreement because you cannot put it in the law. That means that if the government changes, all this goes. And so they become very, very pressed. So they have a high economic uncertainty. And so what our proposal does is actually provides them with certainty to get what they get by law, and not because somebody won more seat in the Knesset. And then the last point is they're afraid to stay alone in that part of the woods. Okay, they understand what's going to happen to their children if the country collapses. Now, whether that's enough for them to accept, I don't know. But if they do accept it initially, going forward, they will have slower growth rate because they won't be able to afford 7 children per family, and they will go to work. And so they will become much more like others, except they will be still very, very religious. But there will be much higher participation in the economy. And remember, going back to the point before that we are separating them, we're actually not separating. Just like brothers and sisters come out of their parents' house, they do not go to live in one house under one set of rules. They go into different houses, establish their own sets of rules, and remain brothers and sisters. If they live under one roof, they will hate each other. So by the same token, we allow everybody to live day to day the way they want to, and then everything else is our joint country that will be run together. By the way, the last point is that not all Haredi will go to this Torah nationalistic. Not most of national religious would not go there. Half of the Arabs would not go to the Arab one. And so this is not partitioning people by the color of their yarmulke or by their last name. It is by their values. If it's important to you, more important to you to be with, running your own show, as they say in Arabic, tfaddal, please. But if it's more important to you to have a liberal democracy, you're very welcome. I mean, I'm not forcing anybody anywhere. I'm just saying, look, you have to choose. We cannot unite the laws. And if you don't like it, you can leave. You can switch.
Eugene, I'm mindful of the time, so I want to end with two themes that come up in the questions. One is just a tremendous amount of skepticism that I'm seeing, and I'm sure you've encountered this elsewhere, about the ability of the existing Israeli political system to move in the direction that you are proposing. So the argument would be, we've been trying to legislate some kind of constitution for 75, coming up to 75 years. There have been a variety of proposals to strengthen the link between elected representatives and the citizenry in Israel by dividing Israel into electoral constituencies. At the moment, Israel is a single electoral constituency. That has gone nowhere because people cannot agree how to divide the country into 120 electoral constituencies. And those kind of things seem to pale in comparison to what you are proposing. To put it very crudely, why would Aryeh Deri begin to entertain the kind of ideas that you're proposing? It seems to me that Aryeh Deri is very happy with the existing system. Yeah. So how do you bridge that gap from the current political system to the one that you envisage? Let's tackle that one.
So yeah, let me start from the first question. I disagree with that statement that's rather simple, like constitution or partition into the areas. If we cannot implement those, we definitely cannot implement this. It's actually the other way around. My claim is that this system is much simpler for people to understand and accept once they think about it, than the systems, for example, constitution. I'll tell you why. Imagine that a Haredi, a national religious, a secular person, and an Arab try to design a constitution. Okay, each of them has to solve a very complex, dynamic game theory problem of how any item in conjunction with other items can be used against them. It's incredibly difficult problem, and the way you solve this problem is you demand a lot of protection to yourself. And since everybody's demanding protection, you can never agree to anything. Okay, that is because we never know what will happen 5 years from now when this thing is tested. What I am proposing is a much simpler thing. It says to Haredi, you will decide how you live. To the Arab, you will decide how you live. And to myself and people who want liberal democracy, we will decide how we live. It's incredibly simple because it says you don't have to solve any problem, how I will affect you in these conditions, etc. Anything that is important to you to the extent that you will go to war over it, you decide. I'm not able and not allowed to touch it. So that is the main misconception. People say, if we can't do this simple, we definitely cannot do this. No, it's the other way around. The second thing, if Aryeh Deri, for those who don't know who Aryeh Deri is, he is the leader of Sephardic ultra-religious party. Sephardic Jews. There are two pieces to this. One piece, if he puts his logical hat on, he should see that that makes sense for his population, because his population will be much better off under this. If he puts his political hat off, I don't know, which is why I want that his voters, non-Haredi and Haredi alike, because a lot of non-Haredi vote for him, would force him in the following sense, that his voters and other voters that will say, we demand that you commit as a politician to two things. You commit to structural change, immediate structural change, so within one electoral cycle, we go to a new system. And two, you will not sit in a coalition with anybody who is not committed. So Aryeh Deri, in that world, Aryeh Deri will have to decide. If he's not committing, he cannot be in the ruling coalition. And there will be much fewer voters that will vote for him, because they'd say, well, he is basically continuing the war. Remember that Aryeh Deri is in a more difficult position than the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, because they really want to just separate. But he represents a population that doesn't want to separate. So for him, it's a more complex issue, and I don't know how he, as a politician, would answer this question.
Okay. Last question. I just want to read out a really interesting question from Noga Eshed Bar-Or, who also asked a question that I think we should end on. So Noga is making an interesting point, and she's saying, is there any way to prevent Haredim from joining the liberal Alumot, making it into what they want, just given the demographic shifts in Israel? But the question that I want to end on, Eugene, is there any place or role in your plan for Jews outside of Israel? So Noga is asking, what do you think is the role of the global Jewish community outside of Israel in this plan? Should Jews around the world be allowed to take part in an Alumah? Question mark. So we'll end on that.
Three answers. Today, I'm actually on a quest to try to convince the Jewish communities everywhere it is their country as well. And as their country, they tend not to intervene in Israeli politics, although not all of them, but they cannot not intervene if there is an existential threat to the country, because it's their country as well. They're part of the Jewish people. So that is definitely the role, and we need their role in basically talking loudly and talking about ending the wars on values. One of the very important parts of the new system has to be a formal voice in Israel to Jewish communities around the world. And given that the Jewish communities around the world are also diverse, there are Haredi communities, there are religious communities, there are secular communities, different degree of religiosity. Each one of them today, they do not find partners in either one or the other government. Today, that allows them to connect much more deeply. And in my opinion, at least in the liberal democratic Alumah, it has to have a potential to give them a formal voice. They will not vote, but there will be like maybe some kind of House of Lords where Israelis, Arabs and Jews, as well as world Jewry sit and make their opinions known. Just like in the UK, where they have no vote, but their opinions count to the population, to everybody. So there is the last part I wanted to say is that this system also allows some kind of confederation with the Palestinians, not Israeli Arabs, but the Palestinians on various terms, because within the confederation, you can vary terms. So the way towards some kind of permanent solution could be a very long confederation with increasingly broad autonomy to the Palestinians. So all kinds of things like that are possible. We're not talking about them right now because they sort of irrelevant, because we believe people who are focused on the conflict will not find a single mention in our entire paper, and that's on purpose, because if we don't solve our internal problems, the conflict resolution is not going to be relevant. And if we do solve our internal problems, this opens a whole bunch of possible solutions, and that is why we don't talk about it yet.
We're living through days of great systemic fluidity, of things that would have been thought completely taboo and impossible even to discuss a year ago are being discussed. And Professor Eugene Kandel, you've given us a lot to digest, a lot to think about. It's not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of the conversation. So thank you very much indeed for this. On February 20th, I'll be in conversation with political theorist and former Minister of Education in Israel, Professor Yuli Tamir, on the question of liberalism, nationalism, so very much related to the themes that we've touched upon today. We've gone a little bit over time, but I think it was totally worth it. But now from the Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies.
Can I just say something?
Yes, Eugene, please, you finish. Yeah.
If you can distribute the document, we would love your comments. There is a website called ISFI, Israeli Strategic Futures Institute. We would love, you can leave your comments there. There is a mail there, so please do.
Great. And we will link the website of the institute to the video, to the webinar notes, and to be continued. Eugene, let me know when you're next in the United States. We'd love to get together.
Thank you so much, Amichai. Thank you it was an honor and a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everyone.